The rain fell upon Thornfield Hall with the weight of judgment, each drop striking the ancient window panes like accusations whispered by God himself, and within those cold marble corridors where autumn's chill had already settled into the very stones, Lady Isabelle Hartley stood motionless in her nightgown, her bare feet growing numb against the floor as she faced the locked mahogany door of her husband's study. 6 hours. She had been a wife for merely 6 hours, the orange blossoms from her hair now wilting upon the dressing table in the bridal chamber she had been meant to share, their fragrance already turning to the sweet rot of decay, and here she remained in this shadowed hallway, illuminated only by the guttering candles in their silver sconces, watching as the wax pooled and dripped like her own dissolving hopes. Through the door, that barrier of wood and brass, and his implacable will, she could hear the scratch of his pen, steady and methodical, the sound of Edward Ashford, Earl of Thornfield, sealing her fate with ink and sealing wax, as surely as he had sealed his heart against her from the moment they had spoken their vows. She had tried to speak to him after the wedding breakfast, had followed him through these very halls with trembling uncertainty, but he had looked at her with those ice-grey eyes that held nothing but cold assessment, and he had said in that clipped, aristocratic tone devoid of all warmth, "Retire to your chamber, madam. There are matters requiring my immediate attention." And then he had disappeared behind this door, turning the lock with a decisive click that echoed through her chest like the closing of a tomb. The hours had crawled past with excruciating slowness, and still she had waited, some foolish part of her believing that he would emerge, that this was merely the preoccupation of business, that their wedding night would yet commence, however awkwardly. But as midnight gave way to the small hours and the candles burned lower, a maid had appeared with frightened eyes to whisper that solicitors had been summoned, that a carriage had arrived through the rain, and Isabel had known then, with the terrible clarity that accompanies irrevocable disaster, that she was not waiting for a husband, but for an executioner. Dawn broke grey and merciless over the estate, the rain continuing its relentless assault, and when the study door finally opened, it was not Edward who emerged first, but 2 gentlemen in black coats carrying leather cases, their faces carefully blank with professional discretion, and they would not meet her eyes as they passed. And then he appeared, her husband of mere hours, tall and rigid in his evening clothes now rumpled from the night, his dark hair dishevelled but his expression perfectly composed, and he looked at her standing there in her nightgown with her hair loose about her shoulders, and he said with brutal simplicity, "The marriage is annulled, Lady Isabel. My carriage will return you to your family by noon." And somewhere in the hall behind her, the last candle finally exhausted itself and died, trailing a thin ribbon of smoke toward the ceiling like a departing soul. The arrangement had been negotiated in her father's dusty study 3 months prior to that disastrous wedding night. The terms laid out with the delicacy of a business transaction concerning livestock or property, for indeed that was what Isabel had become in the desperate calculations of her family's survival, a commodity to be exchanged for the Earl of Thornfield's vast wealth against the security of the Hartley name, such as it remained after her father's unfortunate investments and her brother's gambling debts had reduced their once respectable estate to little more than a crumbling facade of genteel poverty. Edward Ashford had required a wife of unimpeachable breeding to silence the whispers that still clung to his family name, that scandal of his mother, the beautiful countess who had abandoned her husband and infant son to flee to the continent with her lover, dying in shameful exile in Venice when Edward was but 7 years old, and the Hartleys required salvation from complete financial ruin, and thus the match had been made with cold pragmatism on both sides, though Isabel herself had harbored some small, foolish ember of hope that duty might kindle into something warmer. The courtship, if such a word could be applied to those 3 stiff, formal encounters in her family's drawing-room, had revealed nothing of promise. Edward had been punctiliously correct, his manners irreproachable, his conversation limited to the barest civilities, his grey eyes assessing her with the same detached interest one might show a painting being considered for purchase, and she had sensed in him a deep and abiding coldness, a fortress of pride and suspicion that permitted no entrance. The wedding itself had been a small affair, for neither family wished to draw excessive attention, the Hartleys from shame at their reduced circumstances, the Ashfords from Edward's evident distaste for ceremony and his well-known reputation as a proud, remote figure who had never shown interest in any woman and was rumoured to hold all of the fairer sex in contempt, believing them universally motivated by mercenary calculation and capable of the same abandonment his mother had demonstrated. Isabelle had stood beside him at the altar in her mother's altered wedding gown, the lace yellowed with age and carefully mended, and she had spoken her vows in a voice barely above a whisper, and she had felt his hand cold and rigid as he placed the ring upon her finger, and she had dared to glance up at his face and seen there nothing but grim determination, as though he were performing an unpleasant but necessary duty. Still, she had hoped during the brief wedding breakfast, during the carriage ride to Thornfield Hall, during those awful hours of waiting in her bridal chamber, while her maid prepared her and whispered encouragement, she had hoped that perhaps in privacy, in the intimacy that marriage would bring, some softness might emerge, some possibility of companionship, if not affection. That hope had died with his cold dismissal in the corridor, with the locked door and the scratching pen and the dawn arrival of solicitors, and when she had returned to Hartley House in the Earl's carriage, with her belongings hastily packed and her wedding ring removed, returned to the pitying stares of servants and her mother's tight-lipped fury and her father's broken disappointment, she had understood that she had been weighed in some invisible scale of Edward Ashford's judgment and found catastrophically wanting, rejected before she had even been given the opportunity to prove her worth, and the shame of it settled upon her shoulders like a leaden cloak she would carry for all the days to come. The first months after her return to Hartley House passed in a fog of humiliation so thick that Isabelle moved through the days as though submerged in grey water. Every breath and effort, every encounter with her mother's tight-lipped disappointment or the servants' pitying glances another small death of dignity, and she retreated from all society with the instinct of a wounded animal, seeking darkness, declining every invitation, refusing every caller, until the invitations ceased entirely, and the world seemed content to forget that Lady Isabelle Hartley had ever existed at all. The whispers reached her nonetheless, carried by her sister Eleanor, who heard them at the modiste's shop, repeated by the housekeeper, who heard them at market, that she had been found wanting, that the Earl of Thornfield had discovered some fundamental deficiency in her person or character so grievous that he could not bear to consummate the union, that perhaps she was barren or mad or hideously flawed in some unnamed way, and each whispered speculation was a fresh laceration upon her soul, until she began to wonder herself what terrible inadequacy resided within her that had merited such immediate and total rejection. Her father, whose disappointment manifested as wounded silence and long hours in his study, staring at unpaid bills and foreclosure notices, grew ill that winter, a persistent cough that rattled in his chest like stones in a tin, and by spring he had taken to his bed, and by early summer he was dead, having extracted from Isabelle on his deathbed a promise that she would be strong, would care for her mother and sister, would not let this disgrace destroy what remained of their family, and she had given that promise with tears streaming down her face, and then she had retreated to the library and did not emerge for 3 days. It was in that library, surrounded by her father's modest collection of books accumulated over a lifetime of scholarship, that Isabelle began to construct the fortress that would protect her from further devastation. If the world believed her inadequate, if Edward Ashford had found her unworthy, then she would make herself into something beyond their judgment, something that required no external validation, and she began to read with ferocious intensity, teaching herself Latin and Greek from her father's old university texts, devouring philosophy and history and natural sciences, spending 12 and 14 hours a day in focused study until her mother complained of ruined eyesight and wasted candles. The pain of rejection, which had initially threatened to consume her entirely, began to transform, under the discipline of intellectual pursuit, into something harder and more durable, a shell of protective pride that kept the world at a safe distance, a dignified remoteness that mirrored in its way the very coldness that Edward had shown her, though hers was born of self-preservation rather than contempt. She became known in the village as the scholarly Miss Hartley, always with a book, always courteous but distant, never attending assemblies or seeking company, and if the villagers pitied her spinsterhood and her family's reduced circumstances, they also came to respect her quiet dignity, the way she held her head high despite the whispers, the way she assisted with the church school teaching the tenants' children to read, finding in service to others a purpose that her aborted marriage had denied her, and by the time the first anniversary of that disastrous wedding arrived, Isabelle had become someone new, not healed, perhaps, but armored. No longer the trembling girl who had waited outside a locked door, but a woman who had learned that survival sometimes meant building walls so high that nothing, not love nor hope nor pain, could scale them. Edward stood at the window of his study as the carriage, bearing Isabelle back to her family, disappeared down the elm-lined drive, and he felt nothing but cold satisfaction, the clean efficiency of a problem solved before it could fester into something more dangerous, for he had acted with perfect rationality in severing this connection before it could become a shackle upon his freedom and his fortune. Women were mercenary creatures. This he knew with the certainty of long observation, had he not seen how they had circled his father like well-dressed vultures after his mother's abandonment, widows and debutantes alike, calculating the worth of his title and estates with eyes that glittered with avarice behind their fluttering fans. The Hartley girl had been no different despite her veneer of shy modesty. The marriage had been a transparent transaction, her family's debts exchanged for his need of an heir and the social respectability that came with a wife of appropriate breeding. But in those hours after the wedding, alone in his chamber, Edward had been seized by a terrible conviction that he was repeating his father's mistake, binding himself to a woman who would inevitably reveal her true mercenary nature, who would take what she could and give nothing of genuine feeling, who might even abandon him as his mother had done when he was but 7 years old, fleeing to her lover and leaving her small son to wake one morning to find her rooms empty and his father drunk with grief and rage. That abandonment had carved a hollow place in Edward's chest that had never filled, a void where trust might have resided, replaced instead by a fortress of suspicion and pride that permitted no vulnerability, no dependence upon another's affection, for affection was a lie women told to extract what they desired from foolish men who believed in such fairy stories. He had acted correctly, decisively, protecting himself from inevitable betrayal, and if there had been something in Isabelle's eyes outside his study door, some quality of genuine bewilderment and pain that had not seemed calculated or performed, he dismissed it as accomplished acting, for women were skilled in the art of manipulating masculine sympathy, and he would not be deceived. The weeks that followed passed in their usual efficient rhythm. He managed his estates with the meticulous attention that had tripled their value in the years since he had inherited the title. He attended to his parliamentary duties. He rode out across his lands in the early mornings when mist still clung to the valleys, and he felt nothing but vindication that he had escaped the trap of matrimony before it had closed entirely upon him. Yet there came a night, some 6 weeks after the annulment, when he sat in his study reviewing accounts and found his attention wandering to the memory of Isabelle standing in the corridor in her nightgown, her dark hair loose about her shoulders, her face pale as porcelain in the candlelight, and most particularly her eyes, those wide, dark eyes that had held not calculation but something terribly like fear and confusion, the eyes of someone who genuinely did not understand what sin she had committed to merit such immediate rejection, and for the first time Edward felt an unwelcome twist of something that might have been guilt, which he immediately suppressed, for he had done nothing wrong, nothing at all. He had merely protected himself from the inevitable betrayal that all women carried in their nature like original sin, and if some small voice whispered that perhaps Isabelle Hartley had not deserved such cruelty, he closed his mind against it and returned to his accounts, determined that he would not permit foolish sentiment to undermine the rightness of his action. The London season arrived with its familiar glittering tedium, and Edward moved through the requisite social performances with the mechanical precision of a clockwork figure, attending balls and dinners and parliamentary sessions with his customary cold efficiency. But something had shifted in the 6 months since the annulment, some hairline fracture in the edifice of his certainty that widened imperceptibly with each passing week, until he found himself afflicted with a restlessness he could neither name nor banish. He watched couples waltzing at Lady Pemberton's ball and felt an unexpected hollowness, observed Lord and Lady Ashworth laughing together in their box at the theatre, and experienced a strange tightness in his chest that might have been envy, noted the easy affection between his friend Harrison and his wife of 2 years, and recognized with unsettling clarity that his fortress of solitude, which had always seemed a virtue and a protection, now felt increasingly like a prison of his own construction. The season's debutantes, paraded before him by hopeful mothers who saw in his title and wealth a prize worthy of their daughter's artificial charms, left him profoundly cold. Their rehearsed smiles and calculated conversation reminded him of everything he had despised about matrimonial transactions, yet he found himself thinking with increasing frequency of Isabelle's unguarded expression in those final hours, the genuine confusion in her eyes, and wondering with growing discomfort whether his assumptions about feminine duplicity had been as universal as he had convinced himself. The crack in his certainty became a chasm one afternoon in Hyde Park when he encountered Mrs. Dawson, who had served as Isabelle's lady's maid and now worked for a family in town, and she greeted him with such coldness that he was taken aback, for servants typically maintained careful deference regardless of private opinion. "Forgive me, my lord," she said with barely concealed contempt when he questioned her manner, "but I have just received word that my former mistress's father has died, and she is left with almost nothing, and I find I cannot summon the proper respect for the man who destroyed her life so thoroughly that even her father's death was hastened by the shame of it." She departed before he could respond, leaving him standing frozen beside the Serpentine as her words detonated in his mind like artillery fire. Isabelle's father dead, Isabelle alone and impoverished, Isabelle suffering not the calculated distress of a thwarted fortune hunter, but the genuine devastation of an innocent woman whose life he had shattered without cause. That night he did not sleep at all, pacing his study as memory after memory rose to indict him. Isabelle's trembling hands during their wedding vows, her tentative smile when she had bid him good night, her bewildered stillness outside his locked door, and most damning of all, the absolute absence in her demeanor of any hint of the mercenary calculation he had been so certain resided in all women's hearts. By dawn he sat at his desk with his head in his hands, confronting for the first time the monstrous possibility that he had committed a terrible injustice, that he had projected onto an innocent girl the sins of his mother and all the calculating women who had circled his father, and that his protection of himself had been nothing more than cruelty dressed in the clothes of rationality. His pride erected immediate defenses. Surely he could not have been so wrong. Surely there had been some justification, but these fortifications crumbled before the onslaught of remembered details. How perfectly he could still picture every feature of Isabelle's face, though he had barely looked at her during their brief courtship. How her voice had held a quality of sincerity that no actress could sustain. How even now, 6 months later, he found himself thinking of her with a frequency that suggested she had marked him far more deeply than he had ever permitted himself to acknowledge, and the terrible realization dawned that perhaps he had not escaped a trap at all, but had instead destroyed the one genuine thing that had ever been offered to him. The year that followed Edward's awakening to his terrible error transformed him in ways that would have been unrecognizable to the man who had sealed annulment papers with such cold certainty, for he became obsessed with understanding the truth of Isabelle Hartley's character, conducting discreet inquiries through servants and tenants and merchants in her village, until a portrait emerged that devastated him with its gentle clarity. She was, by every account, a woman of genuine kindness and remarkable intellect, who, despite her family's poverty and her own ruin, had taken to teaching the tenants' children their letters, who spent her days in scholarly pursuits that would have impressed any Oxford don, who never spoke ill of him despite having every reason to curse his name, and who bore her isolation and shame with a dignity that made her beloved by all who knew her and despised by none, save those society matrons who found virtue without fortune to be an affront to their world-view. The crushing weight of his mistake pressed upon Edward's chest until he could scarcely breathe, until sleep became impossible and food turned to ash in his mouth, until finally he sat at his desk one autumn evening, a year to the day since their disastrous wedding, and penned a letter of apology that took him 7 hours to compose, and which read, when he finally sealed it with trembling hands, as the most inadequate arrangement of words ever committed to paper, formal and stilted, and utterly insufficient to convey the magnitude of his remorse or the transformation of his understanding. He waited 3 weeks for a response that never came, and the silence was more damning than any accusation could have been, so he wrote again, and this time he abandoned formality and allowed his anguish to seep through every line, confessing his error and his mother's abandonment and the terrible fear that had driven him to such cruelty, begging not for forgiveness which he knew he did not deserve, but merely for the chance to make some form of amends, to repair in whatever small way the damage he had inflicted upon an innocent woman who had committed no sin, save agreeing to marry a man too broken to recognize a gift when it was offered. This second letter received a response, though not from Isabelle herself but from her solicitor, a brief and devastatingly polite note that requested he cease all correspondence, as Lady Isabelle wished no further contact with the Earl of Thornfield, and trusted he would respect her wishes as a gentleman. And Edward sat in his study with that letter clutched in his fist, and experienced for the first time in his adult life the full force of rejection, the bitter irony that he who had so efficiently discarded his bride now found himself discarded in turn, and the pain of it was so acute that he wondered if this was how Isabelle had felt standing outside his locked door, this terrible combination of humiliation and confusion and grief that no pride could adequately armor against. Yet even as he recognized the justice of her refusal, even as he acknowledged her absolute right to deny him any access to her life or thoughts, Edward found that he could not simply accept this dismissal and return to his former existence, for something fundamental had shifted in the architecture of his soul, and he knew with certainty that transcended reason that he would spend whatever remained of his life seeking to earn what he had so carelessly destroyed. Not her forgiveness, perhaps, for that might be beyond his reach, but at least the knowledge that he had tried, that he had recognized his sin and spent himself completely in the effort to atone for it. And if that effort brought him nothing but further rejection and pain, then perhaps that was precisely the penance he deserved, and he would bear it as she had borne his cruelty, with whatever dignity he could manage to summon from the wreckage of his pride. Edward's quest for redemption took a form that would have mortified his former self, for he abandoned all pretense of dignity and began appearing in Isabelle's village with a regularity that set tongues wagging from the vicarage to the posting inn, attending Sunday services at the small stone church where he knew she worshipped, and standing in the back pew with his hat clutched in his hands like a penitent, his presence causing her visible discomfort as she kept her eyes fixed rigidly forward and departed immediately after the final hymn, sweeping past him with her spine straight and her face carefully blank, in a manner that communicated her wishes more clearly than any words. He tried approaching her after services, his attempts at conversation painfully awkward, and met with responses so brief and cold that they could scarcely be called responses at all. "Good morning, my lord," delivered with perfect propriety and absolutely no warmth. "I trust you are well," spoken as one might address a stranger of slight acquaintance. "If you will excuse me," repeated whenever he attempted to prolong the interaction beyond the minimum courtesy demanded. The village watched this performance with speculation that evolved from scandalous interest to gradual sympathy, for it became apparent to even the most casual observer that the Earl of Thornfield was engaged in some form of sustained penance, and while the older residents who remembered Isabelle's humiliation maintained their protective coldness toward him, others began to whisper that perhaps his persistence indicated genuine remorse, though Isabelle herself showed no signs of softening, and indeed seemed to grow more resolute in her avoidance with each passing week. Edward's desperation manifested in grander gestures that revealed both the depth of his remorse and his fundamental misunderstanding of what might earn forgiveness, for he arranged through intermediaries for substantial donations to the village church and school, funded repairs to the aging bridge that connected Hartley lands to the main road, and most audaciously offered through his solicitor to finance complete restoration of Hartley House itself, all of which were refused with varying degrees of polite firmness by Isabelle's man of business, her written responses making clear that she would accept nothing from the Earl of Thornfield, and that his attempts to purchase absolution through largesse were as insulting as they were unwelcome. Each refusal struck Edward like a physical blow, and he began to understand with humiliating clarity that the transactional thinking which had governed his entire life, the belief that all things, including human feeling, could be reduced to matters of finance and negotiation, was utterly inadequate to address the harm he had inflicted, for Isabelle's dignity could not be restored through donations, and her pain could not be erased through repairs to masonry, and what she required from him was something he had never learned to offer: genuine transformation of character, rather than merely the appearance of contrition purchased through expensive gestures. His growing desperation showed in his deteriorating appearance, the careful grooming that had once been second nature giving way to a certain haggardness, and he found himself standing outside the gates of Hartley House at odd hours, simply staring at the windows behind which she lived, her life entirely separate from him, knowing himself to be behaving like a madman but unable to stop, driven by a compulsion he could neither name nor resist to remain in proximity to the woman whose life he had destroyed and whose forgiveness had become more necessary to him than breath itself, though he was beginning to suspect that forgiveness might be forever beyond his reach, and that he would spend the remainder of his days in this peculiar purgatory of his own creation, neither fully damned nor remotely redeemed. 2 years after the annulment that had destroyed both their lives in different measures, Edward Ashford established a ritual that transformed him from earl to penitent, appearing each morning at the iron gates of Hartley House, regardless of weather or season, standing in silent vigil for hours at a time, with no apparent purpose beyond proximity to the woman who would not see him, and the village that had once whispered scandalized speculation about the strange earl who had annulled his marriage before sunrise now began to whisper something different, a reluctant sympathy for the gaunt figure who stood in rain and snow and summer heat with the patience of a monk performing eternal penance. Isabelle observed this phenomenon with emotions that shifted daily between intense irritation and unwilling confusion, for she could see him from her window when she sat at her writing desk, could watch his solitary figure maintaining its post with a constancy that should have been flattering, but felt instead like an invasion, a constant reminder of the man who had rejected her so thoroughly that he had unmade their marriage before consummation, and now apparently sought to undo his undoing through sheer stubborn presence. Her anger at his presumption warred with a curiosity she despised in herself. What did he hope to accomplish through these silent vigils? What transformation did he imagine his suffering would produce in her heart? And more troublingly, why did she find herself noting the changes in his appearance with what felt dangerously close to concern? For Edward had indeed changed in visible ways that even her determined indifference could not entirely ignore. The proud bearing had given way to something humbler. The carefully maintained aristocratic appearance had deteriorated into a gauntness that spoke of meals forgotten and sleep abandoned, and there was a haunted quality to his eyes on those occasions when their gazes accidentally met that reminded her uncomfortably of her own reflection in the months after he had cast her aside. Her resolve to maintain her protective anger would strengthen each time she remembered standing outside his locked door in her wedding nightgown, the humiliation of returning home in disgrace, her father's disappointment and early death that she had never quite stopped blaming on the shame of her failed marriage, and yet that resolve would inexplicably weaken when she watched Edward standing in a downpour, making no effort to seek shelter, as though he believed he deserved every discomfort and would accept it as his due. His silent presence became an unwelcome fixture of her daily existence, as regular as sunrise and equally impossible to ignore, and she found herself structuring her routines around the knowledge of his vigil, avoiding certain windows, altering her walking paths, yet also, in moments she would not examine too closely, positioning herself where she might observe him unobserved, studying this strange, devoted ghost of the man who had destroyed her. Her dreams became troubled by his presence, strange fragmentary visions in which his younger self and his current self existed simultaneously, the cold earl, who had sealed annulment papers, and this patient penitent at her gates somehow the same person and yet entirely different, and she would wake in confusion, wondering which version was real, and whether transformation of such magnitude was even possible in human nature, or whether this was merely another form of aristocratic manipulation, a longer game played by a skilled deceiver. Yet as months accumulated into the second year of his vigil, even her most determined cynicism struggled against the evidence of his consistency, and she found herself trapped in an internal conflict that had no easy resolution, torn between the safety of maintained anger and the dangerous territory of forgiveness, between the woman who had learned to protect herself through rigid emotional distance and some deeper self that wondered, against all reason and self-preservation, whether perhaps his penance might actually be genuine. The crisis arrived in early spring of the third year, when Isabel's younger sister Eleanor, barely 19, and possessed of more romantic sensibility than practical judgment, became entangled with a gentleman of questionable character, a Captain Rothwell, whose handsome face and easy charm concealed substantial gambling debts and a reputation for seducing young women of modest fortune before abandoning them to social ruin. The matter came to Isabel's attention through her mother's frantic letter, and she spent a sleepless night contemplating their limited options, knowing that her family lacked both the social connections and financial resources to extract Eleanor from a situation that was rapidly approaching the point of irreversible scandal. For the foolish girl had been seen alone with Rothwell on multiple occasions and was rumored to be planning an elopement that would destroy what little remained of the Hartley family's reputation. Isabelle was still formulating an inadequate plan when word came that the matter had been resolved. Captain Rothwell had departed the county with unexpected haste, his debts mysteriously paid, and a commission purchased for him in a regiment bound for India, while Eleanor had been retrieved from the inn where she had waited for her false lover and returned home shaken but fundamentally unharmed. The agent of this deliverance was no mystery to anyone in the village, for Edward's involvement, though conducted with as much discretion as possible, could not be entirely concealed, and Isabelle found herself in the unfamiliar position of owing profound gratitude to the man she had spent 2 years avoiding. She composed a brief note of thanks, formal, restrained, but it seemed inadequate to the service rendered, and when Edward appeared at her gates the following morning, as had become his custom, she found herself walking down the path she had never before traversed during his vigils, approaching him directly for the first time in years. He watched her come with an expression that managed to combine hope and terror in equal measure, and when she stood before him, separated only by the iron bars of the gate, the words that had seemed so carefully prepared in her mind dissolved into clumsy inadequacy. "You helped my sister," she said finally, hating how her voice trembled slightly. "You asked nothing in return." Edward's response came quietly, his eyes never leaving her face. "I asked nothing because I deserve nothing, Lady Isabelle. Your sister's welfare required assistance, and I was positioned to provide it. That is the beginning and end of the matter." The careful humility in his voice, so different from the arrogant certainty she remembered from their brief marriage, created a confusion of feeling she could not entirely suppress. "Nevertheless, I am grateful," she managed, each word weighted with the complexity of emotions she would not name. "My family is in your debt." "There is no debt," he said firmly. "I will never again be the cause of harm to you or those you love, even by the indirect means of failing to act when action might prevent suffering. This I can promise, though I can promise nothing else." They stood in silence then, the spring morning bright around them, and Isabelle found herself truly looking at him, for the first time since the annulment, seeing not the proud Earl who had rejected her, but this strange penitent version whose eyes held depths of remorse that her anger had previously prevented her from acknowledging. "Thank you, my lord," she said finally, and though the words were simple, they carried a softening that had not existed in any of their previous exchanges, a minute thawing of the ice that had encased her heart for so long. She saw the impact of those 3 words in his face, watched something like painful hope transform his features, and found herself frightened by the power she apparently held to affect him so profoundly, to wound or heal with the smallest gesture of acceptance after so long a winter of rejection. The transformation that followed Eleanor's rescue was subtle but unmistakable, for though Isabelle did not invite Edward beyond her gates, neither did she continue to ignore his presence there, and in the weeks after their brief conversation of gratitude, he began leaving letters, not the desperate pleas for forgiveness that had characterized his earlier correspondence, but thoughtful essays on philosophy, responses to scholarly works he had somehow learned she was reading, reflections on literature and governance, and the nature of moral transformation that revealed a mind she had never been permitted to know during their disastrous brief marriage. Isabelle told herself she read these letters only out of courtesy, a polite acknowledgement of his service to Eleanor, but this rationalization grew increasingly hollow as she found herself anticipating their arrival, discovered herself composing mental responses during her solitary walks, and finally, in a moment that felt like both surrender and courage, penned a brief reply discussing a point of philosophical disagreement regarding Aristotelian ethics that he had raised in his latest missive. His response arrived with a speed that suggested he had been waiting in hope of her engagement, and thus began a correspondence that neither acknowledged as significant, but which gradually became the intellectual companionship Isabelle had not realized she craved. For Edward wrote with genuine curiosity and formidable intelligence, asking her opinions on matters of substance, challenging her interpretations with respect rather than condescension, revealing in his carefully crafted sentences a depth of thought and capacity for self-examination that the proud Earl of her memory had never possessed. Her maid, Margaret, who had served the family since Isabel's childhood and had witnessed every stage of her mistress's suffering and slow recovery, encouraged this epistolary relationship with gentle persistence, noting that a man who spent 3 years standing at gates and now offered intellectual companionship without demand for anything beyond continued correspondence was perhaps demonstrating the kind of transformation that merited cautious acknowledgement if not yet trust. Isabel's internal debate raged between the part of herself that had learned self-protection through rigid emotional distance and the part that yearned for connection, for the engagement of minds that their letters now provided, for the dangerous possibility that perhaps Edward had genuinely changed in the years of his penance, and that her continued rejection might be less justice than unnecessary cruelty. Yet always beneath her tentative softening ran the deeper fear of repeated abandonment, the memory of standing outside his locked study door in her wedding nightgown while he sealed papers that unmade their marriage, and she would catch herself anticipating his letters with something disturbingly close to joy, and then grow angry at her own weakness, furious that he had somehow breached her defenses not through grand romantic gestures, but through patient intellectual respect, through demonstrating that he valued her mind and sought her thoughts not as prelude to seduction, but as genuine exchange between equals. The letters multiplied through the summer and into autumn, becoming more frequent and more personal, though Edward maintained scrupulous boundaries, never pressing for forgiveness or reconciliation, never making demands beyond her willingness to continue their correspondence, yet revealing through his reflections on literature and philosophy the deeper truths of his transformation, his excavation of his own capacity for cruelty, his ongoing effort to understand and rectify the brokenness that had led him to destroy their marriage before it could begin. And Isabel found herself reluctantly, furiously, inexorably drawn to this version of Edward Ashford, even as she despised her own inability to maintain the protective anger that had sustained her through the worst of her grief. The winter storm arrived in December with a violence that caught the county unprepared, transforming familiar landscapes into treacherous expanses of ice and driving snow. And it was Margaret who discovered Edward collapsed at the gates in the grey dawn, his body half buried in drifts, his lips blue with cold, his skin burning with fever that had clearly been building for days, though he had maintained his vigil, despite the gathering illness, with a stubbornness that now threatened his life. Isabel stood in her morning room staring at Margaret's frightened face as her maid explained the situation, and the moral crisis that descended upon her in that moment felt nearly physical in its weight. For every reasonable impulse demanded she send for the village doctor and have Edward transported to the inn where he might be cared for by those without personal history of devastation at his hands. Yet some deeper instinct, she could neither name nor fully understand, compelled her down the frozen path to where he lay, semi-conscious against the iron bars that had separated them for so long. The decision to bring him inside felt like a betrayal of her own hard-won defenses, yet she heard herself giving orders for his transport to the guest room, for hot water and blankets, for the doctor to be summoned despite the dangerous roads, and within the hour found herself in the unprecedented position of tending to the man who had destroyed her with such casual cruelty 3 years prior, sponging his fever-ravaged face, while he thrashed in delirium and spoke in fragments that gradually assembled into a portrait of suffering she had never imagined existed beneath his aristocratic composure. Through 3 days and nights of crisis, while the storm raged beyond the windows and the doctor made what visits he could between the worst of the squalls, Isabel witnessed Edward's defenses stripped away by fever, heard him cry out for a mother who had abandoned him when he was 7 years old, listened as he relived moments of childhood terror and adult regret, and most devastatingly, was present for his fevered confessions about their wedding night, his immediate paralyzing regret the moment he had sealed the annulment papers, his recognition even then that he had destroyed something precious out of blind fear, his terror of vulnerability so profound that he had chosen to wound first before he could be wounded, his conviction that he was fundamentally unlovable, and his determination to prove that conviction correct through self-sabotage of spectacular cruelty. She sat beside his bed in the small hours of the third night, exhausted and emotionally raw, from days of intimate caretaking and unwilling witness to his broken core, and felt her carefully maintained anger crumbling beneath the weight of unwelcome compassion, for the man revealed in delirium was not the proud earl who had rejected her, but a damaged soul who had acted from such deep wounds that his cruelty, while inexcusable, became at least comprehensible in the context of this larger suffering. When the fever finally broke on the fourth morning, and Edward woke to clear consciousness, the shame that flooded his features as he recognized where he was and understood that she must have heard his delirious confessions was so profound that he could barely meet her eyes, and his hoarse apology for the imposition of his illness seemed to encompass not merely the present circumstance, but the entirety of their tragic history. Isabelle, sitting in the chair she had barely left for days, said nothing, only studied his face with an expression he could not read, her silence more eloquent than any words could have been, her thoughtful gaze suggesting that something fundamental had shifted in her understanding, though what that shift might mean remained unclear even to herself. Edward's recovery was swift once the fever broke, though Isabelle insisted he remain at Hartley House for a full week to regain his strength, and this enforced proximity created a subtle but unmistakable shift in the careful distance they had maintained through years of separation. For when he was well enough to leave his sick room, she found herself offering with stiff formality that barely concealed her own uncertainty, the possibility of occasional visits, brief and rigidly proper, should he wish to continue their correspondence in person rather than through letters alone. The first of these visits occurred on a cold February afternoon, Edward arriving at precisely the appointed hour, with the punctuality of a man who understood he was being granted a privilege that could be revoked at any moment, and they sat in her small parlour with Margaret stationed conspicuously in the corner as chaperone, drinking tea and discussing a recent translation of Plato with the careful politeness of diplomatic envoys negotiating a fragile peace. Their conversations during those early visits remained firmly anchored in the intellectual territory that had proven safe in their correspondence literature and philosophy. Estate management and agricultural innovation, the political debates occupying Parliament. Yet gradually, Isabelle found herself asking more personal questions, cautious inquiries about his perspective on matters that edged closer to the heart of what had broken between them, and Edward responded with an unflinching honesty that never sought to excuse or minimize the magnitude of his cruelty, but rather examined it with the precision of a man who had spent years excavating the ruins of his own character. He spoke of his mother's abandonment when he was 7, her flight with a lover that had scandalized the county and left him with a father turned bitter and suspicious, and explained without self-pity how he had learned to equate vulnerability with inevitable betrayal, had constructed elaborate defenses against intimacy, had chosen to wound first and utterly on their wedding night because some terrified part of him believed that Isabelle's eventual abandonment was inevitable, and that destroying their marriage on his own terms represented a form of control over the pain he believed was coming regardless. Isabelle listened to these revelations with an expression that betrayed little of her internal tumult, her walls thinning incrementally as she began to comprehend not merely what he had done but why, understanding that his cruelty had been born from damage rather than malice, even as she maintained that such understanding did not constitute absolution, for intention did not erase impact, and the girl who had stood outside his locked study door deserved acknowledgement of her suffering, regardless of the wounds that had driven him to inflict it. The village, observing the Earl of Thornfield's weekly visits to Hartley House, began to speculate with renewed interest about the nature of their reconciliation, and opinion divided between those who believed Isabelle too forgiving and those who saw in Edward's patient courtship a rare and moving demonstration of genuine repentance, while within Hartley House itself the household divided along different lines. Margaret encouraging her mistress toward cautious openness, Eleanor writing excited letters full of romantic speculation from her school in Bath, and Isabelle's mother issuing increasingly dire warnings about the folly of trusting a man who had once proven himself capable of such spectacular cruelty. Isabelle herself remained caught in an internal war between the hurt that cried out for continued rejection and the emerging understanding that suggested perhaps transformation was real and redemption possible, and she would lie awake after his visits reviewing their conversations, searching for signs of the cold Earl who had destroyed her, and finding instead only this painstakingly careful man who treated her opinions with profound respect and her boundaries with religious devotion, who never presumed upon her softening or pressed for more than she was willing to offer, and who somehow, inexplicably, had become a presence she anticipated rather than dreaded, a development that frightened her almost as much as his original cruelty had wounded her. 4 years had passed since the annulment, when Isabelle finally allowed the dam of her long-suppressed pain to break, the moment arriving on an unremarkable April afternoon, during one of Edward's now routine visits, when some combination of his careful attentiveness and her accumulated exhaustion from years of guarding her wounds dissolved the last of her protective restraint, and she found herself speaking with raw honesty about what his cruelty had truly cost her. They had been discussing a recent article on agricultural reform, the conversation safely intellectual as always, when something in his casual mention of planning for future seasons triggered in her a sudden blazing awareness of all the futures he had stolen from her that night 4 years ago, and before she could censor herself, she was telling him in a voice that shook with suppressed emotion about standing outside his locked study door in her wedding nightgown, about the particular quality of humiliation that came from being rejected before the marriage had even truly begun, about returning to her family home to face her father's disappointment and her mother's cold recriminations and the village's whispered speculations about what deficiency in her had caused an earl to annul their marriage before dawn. Edward's face drained of color as she spoke, but he made no move to interrupt or defend himself, and something in his absolute stillness gave her permission to continue, the words pouring out in an increasingly heated torrent as she described the death of every hope she had tentatively harbored for companionship and family, the way his rejection had poisoned her ability to trust her own judgment or worth, the years of isolation and shame that had followed, the fundamental cruelty of being discarded like a flawed purchase before she had even been given opportunity to prove herself as wife or partner or human being deserving of basic consideration. Her voice rose as she recounted watching other women her age marry and bear children and build lives while she remained frozen in the amber of his casual destruction, and when she finally spoke of her father's death, 6 months after the annulment, and her terrible certainty that disappointment in her had hastened his decline, the tears she had held back for years began to fall, unchecked down her face as she told Edward with devastating precision exactly how thoroughly he had broken her, and how long the breaking had lasted, and how unfair it was that he now appeared before her transformed and patient, when transformation and patience 4 years ago might have prevented all this accumulated suffering. Through the entirety of her outpouring, Edward remained utterly motionless except for the tears that tracked silently down his own face, and when she finally exhausted herself into silence, he did not offer excuses or explanations, but only said in a voice rough with emotion that everything she described was true and worse than true, that no justification existed for what he had done, that his own wounds did not excuse the wounds he had inflicted, and that he would carry the knowledge of her suffering for the remainder of his life as the just consequence of his cruelty, and if she wished him never to return, he would honor that wish, though it would devastate him, because the last thing he wanted was to cause her further pain by his presence. Isabelle sat, trembling in her chair, emotionally wrung out and strangely lighter, and when Edward moved as though to leave, she found herself saying, "Stay," in a whisper, and they remained in the parlor as the afternoon light faded, not speaking, his restrained presence, somehow a comfort rather than an intrusion. And later, after he had quietly departed with a gentleness that seemed to honor the rawness of what had passed between them, Isabelle realized with something like astonishment that she had begun to forgive him, not because the harm was any less, but because she had finally released it from the locked chamber of her heart, where it had been poisoning her from within. And forgiveness, she discovered, felt less like absolution granted than like freedom claimed. In the weeks following Isabelle's emotional unburdening, something fundamental shifted between them, a transformation as subtle as the turning of seasons, yet as unmistakable as winter giving way to spring, and their visits evolved from the careful formality of diplomatic negotiations into something that began to resemble actual friendship, though friendship threaded through with an undercurrent of awareness that neither acknowledged, but both felt in the charged air between them. Edward began arriving not merely for prescribed afternoon teas, but for rambles through Hartley House's modest gardens, where they would walk the gravel paths, discussing whatever book had most recently captured Isabelle's attention, and she found herself surprised by the sound of her own laughter, a lightness she had not experienced in years, emerging in response to his wry observations about the absurdities of parliamentary debates, or his self-deprecating accounts of his steward's exasperation with his newfound interest in experimental crop rotation. He seemed to treasure each smile she granted him as though it were a precious gift rather than a simple human expression, his face transforming with a joy so transparent it sometimes made her breath catch, and Isabelle discovered within herself a capacity for happiness she had believed permanently extinguished, moments of genuine pleasure that felt like betrayals of her younger self, even as they felt like the first true exhales after years of holding her breath. They were both acutely aware of the deepening of their connection, the way their conversations had progressed from careful exchanges to genuine discourse, the manner in which they had begun to anticipate each other's thoughts and finish each other's sentences. And beneath this growing ease ran a current of something neither dared name, a tension that manifested in lingering glances and careful management of physical distance, in the way Edward's eyes would follow her movements with an intensity he could not quite conceal, and the way Isabelle found herself unconsciously leaning toward him during their discussions, only to correct her posture with flustered awareness. Edward lived in constant fear of moving too quickly and shattering the fragile trust they had built, his every gesture calibrated to communicate respect for her boundaries, while Isabelle wrestled with her own terror of vulnerability, the knowledge that allowing herself to feel anything beyond careful friendship would require a courage that felt beyond her capacity after what his rejection had cost her. The moment of crisis arrived on a warm May afternoon as they walked the garden path discussing Wordsworth's latest collection, when Edward gestured toward a particular line in the volume he carried, and their hands brushed in the transfer of the book, and both froze as though lightning had struck, the simple contact sending a shock of awareness through them that made the air feel suddenly too thin. Isabelle withdrew her hand as though burned, stepping back with an expression of mingled longing and panic, and Edward immediately murmured an apology, his own hand trembling as he lowered it to his side, and in the charged silence that followed she found herself whispering, "I am afraid," the admission escaping before she could censor it, raw and honest and terrifying in its vulnerability. Edward's response came quietly, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that acknowledged the enormity of what hung between them. "As am I," he said, and in those 3 words she heard the echo of her own conflict, the recognition that whatever was growing between them carried the potential for either profound healing or devastating repetition of past wounds, and that stepping toward it would require a courage neither was certain they possessed, though both, perhaps, were beginning to wish they might find it. 4.5 years after the annulment, on a June morning when the roses had reached their fullest bloom and the air carried the mingled scent of honeysuckle and fresh-cut grass, Edward arrived at Hartley House with an expression of such determined vulnerability that Isabelle knew before he spoke that something significant was about to shift between them, and when they had settled in the garden where they now routinely took their walks, he turned to her with hands that trembled slightly and asked permission to make a proposal that was not, he hastened to clarify at her visible alarm, a proposal of marriage, but rather something he believed should have preceded any talk of marriage 4.5 years ago. He told her with careful precision that he had never truly courted her before their first disastrous wedding, that their engagement had been a business arrangement he had treated with cold efficiency, and that he wished now to request the honor of courting her properly, of beginning their acquaintance again as though they were meeting fresh without the weight of their painful history, though of course that history could never be erased, and he would not insult her by pretending otherwise. His request was simply this, that she permit him to call upon her with romantic intention, to bring her flowers and take her driving, and attend to her with all the consideration and thoughtfulness he should have shown years ago, with no expectation of any particular outcome, and no assumption that courtship must lead to renewed offers of marriage, but only the hope that she might allow him to demonstrate through consistent action the depth of his regard and the genuineness of his transformation. Isabelle's immediate response was a complicated tangle of terror and temptation, the idea of formally acknowledging romantic potential between them, feeling simultaneously like the most natural progression imaginable and like stepping toward the edge of a precipice from which she might fall into the same abyss of rejection that had nearly destroyed her before, and she found herself instinctively cataloguing all the ways this could end in renewed devastation, even as some part of her recognized that Edward had already been demonstrating his transformation through 4 years of patient presence and that perhaps a formal courtship was merely an honest naming of what had already been growing between them. She told him with careful deliberation that she would consider his request, but only under certain conditions, that he maintain complete transparency about his feelings and intentions, that he accept her right to end the courtship at any moment, for any reason without explanation or apology, that he understand her trust was fragile and had been hard-won and could still be shattered by carelessness or cruelty, and that he make no assumptions about the pace at which she might be comfortable progressing toward greater intimacy of any kind. Edward agreed to her conditions without hesitation, his relief and joy at her willingness to even consider his proposal so transparent it made her chest ache, and thus began what the village would later describe as the most proper and attentive courtship in living memory, with Edward appearing regularly with thoughtful gifts that demonstrated genuine attention to her preferences, taking her on carefully chaperoned excursions that balanced her comfort with opportunities for private conversation, and treating her with a reverence that seemed to acknowledge both her worth and the preciousness of the second chance she was granting him, while Isabelle discovered within herself a capacity for cautious pleasure, allowing herself to enjoy his attentions while maintaining enough protective distance that she might theoretically retreat if necessary, though with each passing week that distance felt slightly less necessary and her enjoyment slightly less cautious, much to the delight of her sister Eleanor, who declared it the most romantic reversal she had ever witnessed, and to the approval of the village, which had long since shifted from condemning Edward's original cruelty to admiring his persistent dedication to earning redemption. The courtship that unfolded through the golden weeks of summer and into early autumn was unlike anything either of them had experienced before, a delicate dance of advancing intimacy and careful respect for boundaries that felt both exhilarating and terrifying in its genuine emotional exposure, and Edward proved himself an attentive suitor who remembered every casual preference Isabelle mentioned, and translated those observations into thoughtful gestures that demonstrated he truly listened when she spoke. They took picnics by the stream that bordered Hartley House property, spreading blankets beneath ancient oaks, while sharing cold chicken and strawberries and discussing poetry, with Edward reading aloud from Byron and Shelley in his rich baritone, while Isabelle closed her eyes and let the cadence of verse wash over her like a benediction, and she found herself reciprocating by sharing her own favorite passages from the philosophical texts that had sustained her through the darkest years, their conversations weaving between the intellectual and the deeply personal, as Edward began to speak more openly about the wounds of his childhood, about his mother's abandonment when he was barely 7 years old, and how that foundational betrayal had calcified into a conviction that all affection was merely performance, masking mercenary intention. Isabelle in turn found herself able to articulate the particular devastation of their wedding night, the way his rejection had confirmed her deepest fear that she was fundamentally unlovable, and these exchanges of vulnerability were punctuated by moments of unexpected lightness, sudden laughter over some absurdity or shared delight in a turn of phrase, and Edward's face during these moments of her genuine joy held an expression of such reverent wonder that it sometimes made her breath catch. His patience with her occasional retreats into fear proved unwavering. When she would grow distant or cancel a planned excursion without explanation, he simply sent a brief note acknowledging her right to space and assuring her he would be available whenever she felt ready to resume their acquaintance, never pressuring or expressing disappointment, and this consistent respect for her autonomy did more to build her trust than any grand gesture could have accomplished. The afternoon when they first held hands intentionally rather than accidentally arrived in late September as they walked along the village lane, when Edward extended his hand with a questioning look, and Isabelle, after a moment's hesitation that felt like standing at the edge of a precipice, placed her palm against his and felt his fingers close gently around hers, with a tenderness that brought unexpected tears to her eyes at the simple, profound intimacy of chosen touch. It was sometime during those amber weeks that Isabelle acknowledged to herself in the privacy of her own thoughts what she had been avoiding, naming. She loved him, not the cold stranger who had rejected her 5 years ago, but this transformed man who had proven through patient years that people could indeed change fundamentally, and the recognition filled her with equal parts joy and terror, because loving him meant making herself vulnerable to potential devastation again, meant trusting that his transformation was permanent rather than performance. Edward seemed to sense her internal withdrawal even as she tried to conceal it, and rather than pressing closer, he gave her additional space, his letters growing briefer and his visits slightly less frequent, communicating through this restraint that he understood her fear and would not force intimacy she was not ready to embrace, and this perception and respect somehow made her love him more, even as it terrified her that she had allowed herself to reach this precipice where her heart's safety once again rested partially in his hands. The 5-year anniversary of the annulment arrived on an October morning when the light held that particular golden quality of autumn's peak, and the air carried the melancholy scent of falling leaves, and Isabelle woke with a tightness in her chest that had been building through weeks of Edward's careful distance, a pressure of unspoken fear that finally demanded release, and she sent word asking him to meet her in the garden at Hartley House that afternoon with a matter of importance to discuss, her hands trembling slightly as she sealed the note because she knew the conversation she needed to have might end everything they had carefully built. When Edward arrived, his expression held wariness beneath the careful hope, as though he sensed the precipice they had reached, and Isabelle did not waste time with pleasantries, but asked him directly with a voice that shook, despite her attempts at control, whether he could truly promise that he would never revert to the cold, cruel man who had annulled their marriage by sunrise, whether his transformation was permanent or merely an extended performance that might crumble once he had secured her trust and affection, because she had spent 5 years watching him prove himself, and yet some terrified part of her still could not entirely believe that people could change so fundamentally, or that she would not wake one morning to find herself once again abandoned and destroyed. Edward's face went very still as he absorbed her words, and rather than offering immediate reassurance or taking offense at her doubt, he was quiet for a long moment before responding with devastating honesty that he could not offer her absolute guarantees because he was human and flawed and capable of causing hurt even without intention, but what he could promise was that the man who had treated her with such cruelty 5 years ago had been operating from wounds and fears he had since confronted and worked to heal, and that every day he made a conscious choice to be different from that broken, frightened version of himself, and if she found after all these years that she could not trust his transformation, then he would accept her decision and walk away, because he would rather lose her than have her live in perpetual fear of his potential reversion to cruelty. His willingness to release her rather than pressure her trust somehow pierced through her defenses more effectively than any declaration of devotion could have done, and Isabelle spent that night in sleepless contemplation, pacing her room while reviewing in her mind the accumulated evidence of 5 years, the patient presence at her gates in all weathers, the letters that asked nothing but offered genuine intellectual companionship, the intervention for her sister that sought no credit, the fevered confessions during illness, the consistent respect for her boundaries, the thoughtful courtship, the space he had given when he sensed her withdrawal, and she recognized with sudden clarity that transformation was indeed real, and that Edward had proven himself not through grand gestures, but through the patient accumulation of small, consistent choices made day after day for years, and that her fear, while understandable, was now holding her back from the life and love she genuinely wanted. When dawn broke, she dressed with deliberate care and walked to Thornfield estate where Edward was already awake despite the early hour, and when he opened the door his expression shifted from surprise to concern at her appearance on his threshold, and before he could speak she said, with a voice that gained strength as she continued, that she forgave him fully and without reservation, and more importantly she chose him, chose to trust the transformation she had witnessed, chose courage over the safety of continued distance, chose to believe that they could build something genuine and lasting from the ruins of their disastrous beginning, and that if he was still willing, she would very much like to continue their courtship with the explicit understanding that she was now open to wherever it might lead, including the possibility of marriage when they were both ready. Edward's composure shattered completely at her words, tears spilling unchecked down his face as he pulled her into an embrace that trembled with the force of 5 years' accumulated longing and relief, and Isabelle found herself crying as well against his chest while he repeated her name like a prayer of thanksgiving, his hands cradling her head with a tenderness that spoke of reverence for the precious gift of her trust, and they stood entangled in his doorway as the morning sun climbed higher and gilded everything with golden light that seemed symbolic of the illumination breaking through years of darkness. When they finally drew apart enough to see each other's faces properly, Edward's expression held a vulnerability she had never witnessed before as he took both her hands in his and said with a voice still rough with emotion that he had not dared hope for this moment but had dreamed of it every night for 5 years, and that if she would grant him the extraordinary honor he wished to ask her properly to be his wife, not through cold arrangement as before, but through genuine love and mutual choice, and he was lowering himself to one knee even as he spoke, producing from his waistcoat pocket a ring that was not the ostentatious Thornfield heirloom he had perfunctorily given her during their first engagement, but rather a simpler band set with a single perfect sapphire, the color of twilight. His proposal was everything the first had not been, filled with specific appreciation for who she was rather than what she represented, acknowledging the pain of their history while expressing hope for their future, promising partnership and honesty and daily choice rather than assumption of ownership. And when Isabelle said yes, with a voice that gained strength and certainty as she spoke, Edward's joy manifested in a brilliant, unguarded smile that transformed his features and made him look younger than she had ever seen him. Their first kiss happened naturally as he rose from his knee and Isabelle stepped into his space, her hands framing his face as their lips met with a tenderness that carried the weight of 5 years' worth of longing and loss and hard-won redemption, and the kiss deepened slowly as they learned the taste and texture of each other with a reverence that acknowledged this intimacy as the precious gift it was, healing something fundamental in both their wounded hearts through the simple, profound act of chosen connection. The village erupted in genuine celebration when news of their engagement spread. The residents who had witnessed Edward's 5-year vigil at Hartley Gates and Isabelle's gradual softening toward him, viewing the betrothal as a romantic vindication that patience and genuine transformation could indeed overcome even the cruelest of beginnings, and Eleanor embraced her sister with tearful delight, while even their mother managed a grudging approval, softened by relief at Isabelle's material security. The weeks of wedding planning became a joy rather than an ordeal, with Isabelle and Edward making every decision together in consultation and compromise, choosing autumn for the ceremony to echo their first wedding but transform its meaning, and their conversations during this period ranged from practical considerations of household management to deeper discussions about how they would build their marriage on foundations of honesty and mutual respect, with Edward promising never to retreat into cold distance when troubled, but to instead communicate his struggles, and Isabelle promising to voice her needs and fears rather than suffering in silence, both committing to the ongoing work that genuine partnership would require. The second wedding took place on an October afternoon, when the world seemed dipped in liquid gold, the autumn sun slanting through amber leaves that rustled in a gentle breeze, carrying the sweet decay of harvest season, and the small church was filled, not with the stiff formal gathering that had attended their first ceremony, but with genuinely joyful faces of villagers and friends who had witnessed the extraordinary 5-year journey that had brought the couple back to this moment, and Isabelle walked down the aisle in a gown of ivory silk, far simpler than the elaborate confection she had worn before, her face radiant with a happiness that transformed her features and made her luminously beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with ornament and everything to do with the authentic joy that shone from within. Edward stood at the altar watching her approach with an expression of such vulnerable wonder and gratitude that several witnesses found themselves blinking back tears, and when Isabelle reached him and placed her hand in his, she felt the slight tremor in his fingers that betrayed the depth of his emotion beneath his carefully composed exterior, and the ceremony itself became a profound act of reclamation, as they spoke vows they had written themselves that acknowledged without flinching the pain of their history while committing to a future built on the hard-won foundations of trust and genuine love, with Edward promising before God and witnesses that he would honor and cherish her not as a possession but as a partner, that he would communicate rather than withdraw, that he would daily choose the transformation he had worked so hard to achieve, and Isabelle promising to trust his transformation and meet him with honesty rather than protective distance, to build with him rather than merely endure, to believe in the possibility of joy after suffering. The reception held at Thornfield Estate had a warmth the first celebration had utterly lacked, with genuine laughter and dancing and toasts that referenced with gentle humor the unconventional path the couple had taken to reach this moment, and when Edward and Isabelle took the floor for their first dance as husband and wife for the second time, they moved together with an ease and connection that spoke of hard-won intimacy, their eyes locked on each other as though no one else existed in the world. When at last they retired to the chamber that had once been the site of rejection and humiliation, everything was different. The room had been completely redecorated at Isabelle's request, with soft colors and welcoming warmth, replacing the austere formality, and more importantly, they came together not as strangers fulfilling duty, but as two people who had chosen each other with full knowledge and intention, and their wedding night became an act of mutual healing, as Edward touched Isabelle with a reverence that communicated without words how precious she was to him, and Isabelle opened herself to him not with resignation but with trust, and their lovemaking was tender and occasionally awkward and profoundly meaningful, tears mixing with whispered endearments and soft laughter, and afterward they lay entangled, speaking of their hopes and dreams, and making promises about how they would navigate challenges together. And when Isabelle finally fell asleep in Edward's arms, she felt a peace she had not known since before their first disastrous wedding, and Edward lay awake for a long while simply holding her and marveling at the extraordinary grace of second chances. And when morning came, they woke to find themselves still wrapped around each other, and the golden autumn light streaming through the windows illuminated their joined hands and matching rings. And they smiled at each other with the particular joy of those who have survived darkness and emerged into light, and they rose to begin their genuine life together, knowing that challenges would come, but confident that they now possessed the tools and commitment to face them as true partners. 10 years had passed since that terrible dawn, when Edward had sealed annulment papers in his study, 5 years since their second wedding, and the Thornfield estate in late spring had become something Edward's younger self would not have recognized a home rather than a monument, filled with the sounds of children's laughter and genuine warmth that permeated even the once austere marble halls. Isabelle stood in the garden, watching their 3 children play among the rose bushes she had planted, her hand resting on the swell of her belly where a 4th child grew, and she felt Edward's presence before his arms encircled her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder as they observed together the living proof of their hard-won happiness, and she leaned back into his embrace with the ease of long familiarity and deep trust, remarking that their eldest daughter, Charlotte, had inherited his stubborn determination, while their son, Thomas, had her love of books, and Edward laughed softly against her ear and said that young Edward named not for himself, but for the man he had become, rather than the man he had been, seemed to have inherited both their capacity for feeling and their tendency toward brooding, which would require careful guidance. Their life together had not been without difficulties, for old wounds occasionally ached and moments of misunderstanding still arose, but they had built between them a practice of honest communication and patient working through that transformed potential crises into opportunities for deeper understanding, and the estate flourished under their joint management, with Isabelle's intelligence and compassion complementing Edward's administrative skill, their tenants prospering and the surrounding villages benefiting from their combined philanthropic efforts that focused particularly on helping young women in difficult circumstances, giving them choices that Isabelle herself had nearly been denied. When evening came and the children were settled with their nurses, Edward and Isabelle walked together through the gardens, as had become their habit, their fingers intertwined and their steps matched, speaking of the day's events and their hopes for the future, and Edward said quietly that he still sometimes woke in the night, terrified that their happiness was a dream from which he would wake to find himself alone in his cold study with fresh annulment papers before him, and Isabelle squeezed his hand and replied that such fears were natural given their history, but that 5 years of daily choice and genuine partnership had proven the reality of their transformation, and they stood together watching the sun set in shades of gold and rose that painted the sky like a promise of continued grace. Dear listener, perhaps you have known something of their pain, the ache of rejection or the weight of terrible mistakes, the seeming impossibility of redemption or the fear that wounds cut too deep for healing, and if so, let their story speak to the truth that transformation, though difficult and requiring genuine work and time, remains always possible for those with courage to attempt it. People are not fixed in their worst moments but contain within them the capacity for profound growth and change, and while some harm cannot be fully undone, and some scars remain tender even after healing, the human heart possesses a remarkable resilience and capacity for forgiveness when met with authentic remorse and patient demonstration of genuine transformation. Second chances, when earned through years of consistent effort rather than demanded as entitlement, become not erasures of past pain, but testimonies to the possibility of growth beyond our failures, and the courage required both to seek forgiveness and to extend it represents perhaps the highest expression of human dignity and hope. May you find, in whatever darkness you navigate, the patience to allow transformation, its necessary time, the wisdom to recognize authentic change when it appears, the courage to remain open to redemption while protecting your wounded heart. And may you know that both the seeking and the granting of forgiveness are acts of profound bravery that honor the complexity of human nature and the precious possibility of becoming better than we have been. May your nights be peaceful and your days touched with the golden light of hope, and may you trust that even the coldest dawns can give way to warm and joy-filled afternoons if we possess the courage to remain open to grace and the patience to allow love its slow and healing work.